this crash of the Stinson. My interest has been quite long, and it was probably prompted more by the fact that my father was I think I'm not standing in the right position for, is that best? Yeah, that's where you want me. If I'd known you were going to film me, I think I would have done my hair this morning. Anyway, suck it up. My father was a World War II bomber pilot, went to the UK, fortunately towards the end of the war. So I grew up with flying and, sort of lots of air stories. Fortunately, he went into Bomber Command, and that's a topic that I could talk about at another time. But very interesting. A lot of Australians lost their lives in that particular part of the air warfare over Europe. But he went late, and therefore I became a classical war baby boomer because he came home, and 10 months later I was there. The other topic that you might be interested in, which I'll just flag for a very quick moment, one of the talks I've been giving recently, which I did suggest to Len, is the Burke and Wills expedition. And I've been very interested in but my emphasis, which is also today, is I did a history degree at the Australian National University, and I was very privileged to have Manny Clark, who I'm sure many of you would recall or know of, a bit left, but he really emphasised that history is not so much about dates and those sort of facts which are very provable, like when did the Wall Street crash occur, or when did Germany invade Poland, those dates. He said it's always about the people. He said if you can draw the people out of history, then that's really what history is about. So Burke and Wills, to me, I really looked at the whole leadership crisis that they had with Burke being a very inappropriate leader and how that affected. They lost 9 people, by the way, in that expedition, which is pretty sad. And so coming to the Stinson crash, I can talk a lot about the aeronautical aspects of it, also the miraculous sort of discovery that Bernard O'Reilly achieved when he found 2 of the survivors alive. But to me, the interest is, why were they so keen to travel that afternoon? And I see there's a good proportion of women in the audience, so that makes it easier. The real cause of the crash was a woman. I'll repeat it. The real cause of the crash. Well, I'm not joking. Wait until I finish my presentation. So, okay. Well, they always are. I have 53 years of marriage behind me, and I've learned 2 words. Yes, darling. Yes, darling. Okay, let's get on with the crash. The Stinson. It was on the Friday afternoon, the 19th of February, 1937. And aviation was really just getting on its feet in Australia at that time. And of course, being such a large continent, aviation was the answer, which Qantas, of course, discovered some years earlier, to the distance problems and how people could move about this huge continent. And right, it's not going to do what oh yes it is. So the Stinson was the state of the art aircraft at that time, and I know that if you're geographers, you would be very observant on detail, which as a journalist I try to be as well. Now think and look at that aircraft. And first of all, who's been to O'Reilly's? Have most of you been to O'Reilly? Has anyone actually done the trek out to the crash site? Oh, well done. I have not done it because I would love to. I've got as far as the border track, and then there was about another 6 k's off to the right. So you may, and the rest, yes. Well, think about Bernard O'Reilly, who's, the no track. Eh? But look at that aircraft and tell me what features of that aircraft you think are unusual, and even in present day aviation. Any particular things stand out to you?
The windscreen.
Oh, the windscreen's dipped in. Yes, exactly. That's the point, and that was a factor in the crash. Something else? Oh, that was standard wheels. They were fixed undercarriage. That was pretty normal. They didn't really start to develop, retractable undercarriages until, well, a bit later, the start of the Second World War. Beg pardon? It's got 3, actually. Yeah, there's one in the centre, so 3 props is a bit unusual. The wings. Now, you can't really see it, but you can in the top diagram. The struts come down on, so if you think about aeronautical, you get lift, and that's very unusual. So the struts coming down rather than lifting up the wings is highly unusual. Made them quite vulnerable as a, particularly if they got into some draft problems, which this did. The other thing is the door. The door's on the right-hand side, or what we refer to as the starboard side. Even in today's aircraft, if you fly into New York, fly into Auckland, fly into Buenos Aires or wherever, all passenger aircraft are light on the left-hand side. True, and the whole design of airports around the world is for aircraft to come in. I mean, they can, but very few aircraft release or discharge or load the passengers on the starboard side. Now, you mightn't think that's very relevant, but it was relevant to this crash, which I'll come to shortly. So the only entrance to that aircraft for the passengers getting in there, and of course the crew, that's how the crew got in, was on the right-hand side. Right, some other, well, I've just given you the answer. That's the specification. I don't know if any of you have great aeronautical understanding, and I did become a student pilot for about 130 hours, and that was when I was 17, 18, and I was working part-time trying to go to uni, and I realised that it was either flying or women that I had to account for as far as my money was concerned, so I gave up the flying. Surprise, surprise. But it's a radial engine, and those of you who know the radial engine is, well, as it says radial, and that's how it turns the propellers. It was, some rated it as being underpowered, but for the time that it was designed, an American-built aircraft, Stinson was quite a well-known company, and they built a number of other aircraft. But it had 3 engines, radial engines, struts from the top, access through the exit door was on the starboard side, and it had the inward sloping windscreen. The inward sloping windscreen, you mightn't think it was important, but when it rains, the water actually gathers rather than goes off, which was a little bit unusual. I don't know why they did that, but this might have been an experiment, but that was a feature. And if you see that model that's up at O'Reilly, it is, to a certain point, an exact replica, except it's 9/10 the original size. I don't know why they didn't build it. It was a model which was built for Channel 10 when they did the film. And I don't know if any of you ever saw the film of it with who was starring as Bernard O'Reilly, Jack Thompson. I think it was Jack Thompson, yeah. He starred as Bernard O'Reilly. It never actually went commercially. It was only ever on TV. I've got a copy of it, and they do have a copy of it up at O'Reilly's. And it's quite accurate to a certain extent, but there are a couple of major inaccuracies in it, which of course commercial television does. A couple of key documents. On the afternoon, it was due to take off at 1 p.m, which it pretty well did. It was on time. They were very keen to maintain their schedules because it was just in its infancy. So people were really they were paying a lot of money for their flights. So they wanted to know, we're taking off at 1 o'clock and we're going to arrive in Sydney at 4:50, I think it was. So they were very keen to be punctual. And they were looking at the weather report. Now, this is where it gets interesting. It wasn't controlled by any central authority. The companies themselves could pretty well decide whether they took off, landed, whether the weather was bad or not. But they did have to record a flight register, and it may be a bit hard for you to read it there, but you'll see the flights that came in from Sydney to Archerfield and left from Archerfield are all recorded there. Now, if you look down carefully, you'll see that almost every pilot who flew into Archerfield up until, now we're looking at the aircraft, U-88, which was Boyden's aircraft. Boyden was flying it, he was the pilot. Everyone else said the weather was bad, except Boyden, who got in at 11:40. Can you see that? I think there's a pointer here. Doesn't matter. Okay, you can see about 6 down that Boyden says the weather was okay. Now, I think that was because Boyden was a very experienced pilot, and he thought, oh, yeah, these young guys don't know what bad weather's like. I know what bad weather's like. So he just recorded it as being okay. Whereas the others had it down as bad. And you'll see that actually later on, when he put in okay, I think all the others sort of felt, well, if Boyden reckons it's okay, then it's okay. So there was presumption, even though there was a low low weather pattern developing off the coast at the time. His intended flight path, which he didn't have to fly, file, he just basically said, oh yeah, I'll probably fly directly south, because he had to pick up some passengers in, I better stand back a bit. So I'm still in the Zoom. Hello, you people out there in the Zoom. I hope you're awake and enjoying the talk. He didn't have to tell anyone where he was going, other than he had some passengers that he was meant to pick up at Lismore. And those of you who know the area there would know that the ridge line, that once you get to where the border track is, it's downward all the way. It's, a descending, and he knew, as all the pilots did, that if he could get over that last ridge, he was home and hosed to Lismore. They did telephone Lismore to say, what's the weather like? And the report was it was raining heavily, and of course it was a grass strip, there was no tarmac. And they said, you may have problems landing because it's very wet here. So Boyden basically thought, oh, well, we'll see what happens. If I have to overfly Lismore, then I will. Now, there was also a suggestion that he said, in just to chatter before he got on the flight, he said, oh, well, if the weather's really bad, I'll go out west. So he'd go further away from the weather pattern, or back down the coast, which was the way that he had come up from Sydney earlier that day. He was last seen climbing over Mount Widgie, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now, the importance of him climbing over Mount Widgie is because when the crash was examined by the coroner, there was some suggestion that he was flying too low, that he wasn't actually flying high enough to get over the last ridge, which was higher than Mount Widgie. Lower than Mount Widgie. And he was seen by about 3 locals, well and truly above Mount Widgie. So the question of him actually getting towards the ridge, which is where he ultimately crashed, he was actually high enough at that last physical sighting. It crashed at about 13:31. In fact, it almost certainly crashed at 13:39, to use military terms. What time is that in everyone's language? 1:40. Well, 1 minute before. How do we know that? No, they had a seismic recorder. Yeah. No, they found one of the watches about 3 months later. Yeah, it was stopped. Now, presumably that watch was accurate, but the watch had stopped at 1:39. So that's about right. That's the timing that was pretty. So that's what I said. Have any of you been around the other side of Airlines, out in Lost Valley? It's a lovely area, isn't it? It's beautiful. And that's where, of course, Bernard set up his Lost Valley. We went out there and met a couple of people who really knew a lot about it, and that is Mount Widgie, the bottom one. And at least 3 locals saw it flying over there at above the height of Mount Widgie. And I think, I thought I had the height of it. 980 metres, which is what, about 2,000 feet, is it, roughly? 3. Yeah, I should have multiplied by 3 instead of 2. Thank you. Right, let's have a look at Rex Boyden. He was age 40 at the time of the crash. He had a remarkable history. He was in the first AIF, and he went to Gallipoli later, didn't land in April, and he was in the very famous Battle of Hill 60, and it's possibly picked up from Len. I'm also a military historian. I've really looked fairly closely at Australia's military history, at nearly all of its campaigns. I was in Vietnam for 2 years. Actually, I got a medal from them yesterday, which was very kind, thanking me for my service. So, signed by the Prime Minister and a few others, the Governor General. He was fairly badly wounded and evacuated to the UK, where he fell in love with his cousin, as it turned out, second cousin, Marjorie. And sadly, she died of TB, so that romance fell apart. He returned to Australia, and like a lot of those fellows from the IF, they wanted to get back because they wanted to support their mates. They wouldn't accept him back into the IF because he was wounded. So he worked his own passage on a merchant ship back to the UK and joined the Royal Navy Air Corps. I don't quite know how he did that, but he must have been a good talker. Now, if you think about flying in World War I, it's pretty dangerous, particularly if you're up against the Baron, the Red Baron. But he was on patrol with the Royal Navy. Now, they weren't involved in combat. They were involved in surveillance to blockade Germany. So he did, patrolled up and down the North Sea to stop vessels going in and out of Germany. And as you probably know, it was one of the factors which caused the end of World War I because of the blockade and supplies getting into Germany. So it was a relatively safe way of flying. So that's where he got his flying hours up. He joined after coming back from the war. He joined Butler's Air Service, and they did a thing called barnstorming. And you might think that little cartoon on the left-hand side is exaggerated, but that's where the term comes from. They did actually, fairly strangely, they would fly through a barn. That was part of their aerobatics, and they were pretty crazy. And there are a lot of them around who wanted to just get work. And barnstorming was the name that they were given with, and they used to fly around to country towns. And interestingly, my father comes from Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, and he, for his 12th birthday, was given a barnstorming flight by Kingsford Smith. And they went out, and apparently there was a queue. And I think it cost them £2, which was quite a lot of money. And Kingsford Smith, and he never ever stopped talking about it, but he flew with Kingsford Smith in, and they did one circuit, for £2, which obviously for a young boy at 12 who was interested in aviation, it was thrilling. But that's how they generated their money, because a lot of them just couldn't find work and they loved flying. Of course, some of them went off and formed Qantas. There was the Airlines of Australia, which was engaged in probably competition to Qantas, but they were running a passenger service and, to a lesser extent, mail service on the east coast of Australia. And they were really starting to do well because they were making sure that their flights were on time, and that's why they acquired the 4 Stinsons. It was rumoured that Rex Boyden had an interest in Amy Johnson, the famous US aviatrix. I was very fortunate in one of those bizarre occasions. I'll see if I can pull it out shortly. I was travelling on the Rhine about 4 or 5 years ago, and I got chatting to a chap whose surname was Boyden. And I said to him, "Oh, are you any relation to Rex Boyden?" And he said, "Oh, look, that was my grandfather's brother, so, great uncle." And I said, "Oh, okay, what do you know about it?" He said, "Well, I've written a book on it." And I thought, wow, he's written a book, and here we are travelling on the Rhine. And he was a chap who actually knew me in Canberra through my work as a journalist. And he said, "Oh, I remember you." He said, "As a matter of fact, I have a copy of the book on board." My eyes lit up. And as a matter of fact, he said, "You can borrow it." And then when he gave it, he let me, and then he said, "Look, Phil, I know how interested you are. You can have it." And I have a copy of it in my bag, and I'll pull it out in a moment, which I found extraordinarily interesting because it had some material in there that I'd never seen before. It's also got the full coroner's report, which I found very interesting, which, part of which I am going to give you some of that information. So it was just one of those serendipity things. Wow, and I've got this book. I'll pull it out in a tick. He was a highly experienced pilot. He was not prone to taking risks. He was a mature pilot. He'd got over 5,000 hours flying. He was in good health. But he was upset by some of the things that happened. Now, you've got to tell me, Lynn, what time do I have to finish?
Oh, about 11 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Now I can do that easily, including questions. That's fine. He's just going back in part of his history. He had gone up into northern New Guinea. And do any of you know what was happening in northern New Guinea in the late 20s, early 30s?
The Germans,
Who, not then. The Germans. Gold. They had gold, but they couldn't get into the mines other than by air. And they flew a lot of the equipment, a lot of the personnel, a lot of the supplies went in and out of that part of northern New Guinea. Apparently, it was a pretty significant find of gold. I don't know enough about that. But he was one of those pilots, and he did have a crash there on coming into landing, and he pancaked it into the jungle, which is quite relevant to what happened later on. So he had one crash before, and that's a photograph of the Junkers that he was in, AVG, and apparently he got out unscathed. There was no fire. There was hardly any fuel because he was landing. But the most disastrous thing that apparently happened is the aircraft was full of beer. And the recipients were not very happy that he'd pretty well written off their beer supply. But So I think that was in his mind when he got into trouble. I'm jumping ahead a bit, when he was getting into trouble on the Stinson Crash. Okay, here we get to the woman. His co-pilot was Bev Shepherd. Now, in those days, they didn't have a co-pilot. You know, they couldn't afford a co-pilot. And Bev Shepherd, I didn't point it out, I should have. Bev Shepherd had a day off, but they said, we need a pilot to fly from Sydney up to Archerfield to take an aircraft up there to meet our schedule. And Bev was on his day off. I think Bev was short for Bevan, I'm not sure of that, but he was known as B. And he was a young, handsome-looking fellow. As you can see, he's much taller than Rex. That's him on the left-hand side. And he came from a wealthy family from Double Bay in New South Wales. He got the bequest, and apparently his auntie knew how much he loved flying, and she bought him a puss moth, which was the actually precursor to the tiger moth. He joined the Airlines in 1936, and it was supposed to be his day off, but a wonderful woman had come back to Australia, and she was an aviator. Any Kiwis in the room? Not a single Kiwi. Huh. I thought they all moved over here. Have any of you heard of Jane Batten? All right, let me tell you about Jane. Drop-dead gorgeous young aviatrix who held the record. And we should know a lot more about it. She held the record of flying between London and Sydney for about 18 months. Very well known in New Zealand and drop dead gorgeous. And she had arrived in Sydney the day before. Rex and Bev and her had a bit of a romance going, and he had contacted her and she had promised to go out with him that Friday night. So his deal with the company was, yes, I'll fly to Brisbane, but I must get back to Sydney on the Friday night because I've got a hot date. And look at her. I'd want to go back to Sydney to meet up with her. She is quite famous as a fashionista as well, and a very well-known pilot at the time. He even telephoned her from Archerfield just before they were about to take off to confirm that he was still good for the date that night. And he got a bit of a ribbing by a boy, and she said, what's that good-looking, Jean Button, why is she going out with you? She should be going out with me. There was a bit of banter. And he wasn't really a co-pilot as such. Now, if any of you got a pilot's license or been flying at all? Okay, where does the pilot in command always sit, even today? Which side? Left-hand side, yeah. So, if you're in command, even in today's aircraft, you're in the left-hand side. That's the command, the chief pilot or whatever. Co-pilot sits on the left-hand side. That's where he sat, not because he was so much a co-pilot, but because he was getting his lift back to Sydney. There were, in fact, no controls on the left-hand side anyway. There were only single controls on the pilot side. So he just was getting a ride back. So he sat in there, and they were apparently joking a bit. But there was, in the coroner's report, there was an observation by the two survivors that they saw them tapping one of the instruments, which I think, from what I can work out, was the altimeter, and they were tapping it. So there may have been a problem with one of the instruments, that they were not certain that it was working properly, because when they're on the ground, apparently it wasn't reading quite the right way. But he was very relaxed. He looked up to Rex, he was the senior pilot. So, if Rex thinks it's okay to take off, then fine with me. Just before the crash, they also saw them checking the instruments again because the door had flown open, and one of the passengers, which was Proud, I think, who survived, he looked in and saw them getting a bit concerned about the instruments. Anyway, so that was where the woman was at fault, because Bev wanted to get back to Sydney regardless. Right, now, you'd like that bit. All right, let's have a look at the interior of the aircraft. On the left-hand side, we have 3 passengers, and you'll see the seats marked. The one at the front, which is where John Proud was sitting, and Jim Westray was in the second seat. And then there's a fellow by the name of Binstead, who was travelling under the name of Barnett. He was sitting at the back. And then on the right-hand side, on the starboard side, there were 2 passengers, William Fountain and James Graham. Now, I'm going to tell you a bit more about these fellows. That's probably a bit hard for you to read. Let me just go back because I know it well enough. Anyone know who John Proud was? That's his brother. The Proud Jewelers was his brother. John Proud became Sir John Proud, and he became the head of Pico Wallsend, the big mining company. And he was into mining. He'd just come down from New Guinea. He had malaria and he was cranky. He just wanted to go back to Sydney, and he didn't have a ticket when he arrived at Archerfield, and apparently put on a bit of a song and dance. So, I demand to be on this aircraft because, I'm John Proud. And the decision as to whether he was going to get a seat on the aircraft depended on the pilot, on Rex. And basically, Rex, apparently there was this altercation, quite loud, in the waiting area. And they said, look, Mr. Proud, you don't have a ticket. And anyway, Rex apparently came and said, oh, whatever, put him on. The problem was they had to pick up 4 passengers at Lismore. And Rex knew that if he took on, John Proud, he might have to tell one of the passengers in Lismore that they couldn't get on the aircraft. So there was that sort of unsettling. Jim Westray, so basically Proud wanted to get home. He'd had enough. He was sick and he didn't want any nonsense with people telling him he couldn't fly. Jim Westray was a brilliant young walker. He was very well known for his walking, a young fellow who was absolutely cricket mad. And he had come out to Australia. He was with Lloyd's. He'd come out to Australia to do a consultation, but brought his wife out, a new wife, and he was going to attend the cricket in Sydney. Guess who was playing and batting in Sydney on the Saturday? Bradman. And so if you're an Englishman, you want to see Bradman. So he had come up to Brisbane earlier in the day, done his business, and went out to Archerfield, and his companion, whose name I can't remember, said, look, the weather's pretty bad. You shouldn't be flying. And he said, no, I've got to get back to Sydney because I've got tickets to go to the cricket tomorrow, which was pretty compelling. So he was anxious to get on board as well. I have a lot of time for him, and I'll tell you more about him shortly. So he was a young, fit, healthy guy who was sitting on the left-hand side. The most interesting thing, and because I like, taking the piss out of Queenslanders, is Joe Binstead, or Barnett. He was part of the White Shoe Brigade, very early member, and he was doing a run because he had a pocket load of money in his possession. He did survive the crash. Now, why was he carrying a lot of money? Because he'd just been to the races, and he was doing a runner for the bookies and avoiding tax. And basically, he was taking the cash down to Randwick, which was holding its races on Saturday afternoon. So he was doing a delivery for his bosses to clean up, to launder the money that was needed for whoever had invested in the races. Now, why did he go under an assumed name? His answer later on was, oh, my wife didn't like me travelling by aircraft, so I changed my name. Well, pretty weak excuse. But even though I have a go at him, he turned out to be a very brave man, and I'll tell you about that shortly. So Joe Binstead was a crook, a soft crook, White Shoe Brigade type crook, which seems to be tolerated up to a point in Queensland, up to a point some years ago. On the other hand, on the other side, we have William Fountain. Now, he was a US architect. Oh, by the way, Binstead was a Kiwi. He was born in New Zealand, so that sort of doubles his interest. So we've got a fairly international crowd. We've got Westray as a POM, Binstead is a Kiwi, and William Fountain was an architect. And he was quite well known. He had come out to Australia, and he designed the Cremorne Theatre, and a couple of other buildings around Brisbane were his work. And he was going back because the next day was his birthday. So Saturday was his birthday. His family had come out from the US. They were waiting for him in Sydney. So he had to get back to Sydney as well because he'd promised to be with his family on his birthday. James Graham was a businessman in the printing industry. He had grown up in Brisbane, but he lived in Sydney, and he had just finished a week's work, and he basically just wanted to go home and be with his family. And those of us who have been away at times with work know what it's like. If you've been away for a week, you just want to go home. And if the pilot says it's okay to travel, then fine, let's travel. So that's the passengers. Right, the weather. If you look at the weather, which was published in the paper that day, you'll see that there's a low over on the coast, just off Southport there. And it was creating a very serious wind gust towards the west. estimated to be about 120 miles an hour. So, you know, it was a pretty, oh, hang on, no, sorry, 120 kilometres an hour. So it was a pretty severe weather draft. And when it hit the range, as you would expect, the draft goes up and then pulls down on the other side. That became a major factor in the crash. I've flown, in fact, we used to do it with a bit of fun, but sometimes you could fly, if you were heading into the wind, you could fly at a mountain and you could feel yourself being lifted over. So the draft was coming down. So you had to be very careful if you had to watch where the wind was. So if you had the wind behind you, fine. If you had the wind in front of you, you were actually facing a downdraft. Now, even though the woman was to blame, I think the weather had a big factor to cause the crash. There were 7. I run through that. You've all got that. That's a photograph of Archerfield with the call sign. I don't know if, do any of you know that every aircraft that's registered in Australia is a VH aircraft, Victor Hotel, and we all use phonetic things, and it was uniform hotel, hotel. And the other 4 Stinsons all had the same double letter, so they're UH, I can't remember what they were, but there's a couple of them lined up there. We still, to this day, if you look out at any aircraft, they're all got the VH call sign as the Australian call sign. There, I've given you that. There's a book written by Bruce McDonald, which I've drawn quite a bit of information from, but I've basically told you that. What caused the crash? Okay, I'll concede the cyclonic weather. And now I'm told you people into weather, meteorology as well, you would be a bit, wouldn't you? That you don't actually have cyclones this far south, correct? You have cyclone, or you can. All right, people have told me that you can't refer to a cyclone south of, you know, certain latitude, but I'm.
You see the boundary of the Coral Sea is extending from Point Danger out. So technically, a cyclone is there where it's not a coral sea or goes.
Okay. Well, I've referred to it as a cyclonic weather event to try and keep myself out of trouble. And there was 4 weather reports, no communication. There was not even a telephone with Riley, so they didn't know what the weather was like. It was mildly rain in at Archerfield. It was just, you know, but it wasn't windy or cyclone. There was a ferocious downdraft as he approached the very last ridge, and that's where he may have been unable, because it had clouded in, and the 2 passengers who survived and gave evidence at the coroner said they couldn't see out the window. You know, there was so much rain and cloud that it was impossible to see. And I think that's where the algorithm might have been affected, because they probably didn't know exactly what height they were at, and they had probably been pushed down from the height they had earlier. There is also a suggestion, which came out in the coroner's report, that as it climbed, the temperature drops dramatically in the storm event, and that causes what is called icing, which means that the fuel becomes ice. There is a procedure that most pilots knew about, that you could improve the mixture. I don't exactly know how you do it, but there was about a 30-second way in which you could de-ice the engines, and there was some suggestion that they might have lost 1 engine, maybe even 2, when the temperature dropped, and they were trying to deal with that. And the co-pilot also was working with him. You could see there was some drama going on in the cockpit just before. Now, let me just go ahead with the very last point, mountainous terrain with no. When you're flying, and every pilot would know this, you're always thinking, what would I do if I have an engine failure or I have to land very suddenly? And even if you're an experienced pilot doing the, Los Angeles to Brisbane flight, you're always thinking, okay, where, if I'm in trouble, is it Fiji, Hawaii, or, the Solomons or wherever? The same if you're flying commercially. You sort of think, where is there a safe place to land? Boyden, I believe, knew that that last ridge would get him home and host. If he could get over that last ridge, he was on his way to Lismore, because there were no more mountains higher than that. But he couldn't, he began, apparently, one of the passengers said they saw leaves going past and, a bit of foliage. So he must have been pretty close to, as it turned out, he was about 300 metres, or about 300 yards down the side of the ridge. If you don't know what's ahead, the safest thing to do is do a U-turn, is to go back from where you came, because you know what's behind you, you know where you've been. And he was doing a turn which came around, so he did a left-hand turn, and this came out in the corners, and then he went down and he sort of decided to pancake it into the foliage without realising that there was a whopping great tree on the right-hand side. So they slammed into that tree. I believe that Boyden and Shepherd were killed instantly because it was a significant impact. And it wasn't very long, within a very short time, like less than a minute, that a fire began because it was fully fueled up. Now, the problem was, if you recall, the door is on the right-hand side, the passengers on the right-hand side were trapped. They couldn't get out that door. A window had broken open on the other side, if I could go back to it. A window had broken open, the second window, which is where Binstead was, and he was a big fat chap, and he tried to get out through the broken window, and apparently he got stuck. And apparently Westray gave him a good kick up the arse and pushed him out through the window, and it probably saved his life. But he burnt his hands at the same time because he attempted to rescue the two other chaps. This was Fountain and Graham on the right-hand side, and he couldn't do it. And then he found that Proud had suffered a fractured leg, and he couldn't move properly. So Westray actually saved the other two and pushed them out. They had to move away from the aircraft because it started to burn, and apparently it burned for about 8 hours. It was a ferocious fire, which of course we know was one of the reasons Bernard O'Reilly found it. There were 7 on board. Let me just recap. Proud, Binstead, Westray, and 2 remaining passengers. They were saved ultimately. Sorry, the 2 Proud and Binstead were the only survivors ultimately. Westray was, apart from some burns to his hand and his buttocks, he was pretty fit. And the next day, after they had crashed, he said that he thought he could see some houses. And both Proud and Binstead said, well, we can't see them. Now, he claimed to them that he could see some houses. Now, I think he was pointing towards Christmas Creek. What he did was what probably any bushwalker would do, is he followed the creek down. He went off that Saturday morning and called out and said, I'm going to go and get help. You two better stay here. And they were sheltering. Had a miserable night. Apparently it rained most of the night. And he took off and not to be seen again. So they were there for about another, and I'll jump forward a bit. Westray said he would be back. Now, when the aircraft wasn't reported until quite late in the day, late on Friday evening, when it didn't, they thought by the time, they even thought it might have landed somewhere safely, which it could have done. But by about 8 or 9 o'clock on the Friday afternoon, a search began, but of course it was too late, it was dark, and there was a massive search. There was a lot of media interest. A couple of aircraft did fly over the crash site, but when you think about it, there wasn't very much to be seen from the air, and also there was only the one burnt tree, which as a pilot or observer on a light aircraft you wouldn't have been able to see. But there were some amazingly wrong sightings. One police sergeant from Coffs Harbour said he saw it going through Coffs Harbour. And someone also said they saw it crushed off Bondi Beach. So there were all these erroneous reports. The most common sightings were apparently around Barrington Tops, which of course never got that far, Barrington Tops being about 200 kilometres north of Sydney or Newcastle. So the searchers were really in the wrong place, and they didn't do a very good search at all over the area where the crash was. Westray died on his attempt to get out of the crash site. He got about halfway down. He was only about less than a kilometre from the base of the creek, as it turned out. Bernard O'Reilly, and I will skip through that story because we probably know a fair bit about it. He was living up at O'Reilly's, and he heard of the report on the radio through a friend. And he also heard some of the neighbours say, we saw the aircraft flying over Mount Widgie. And so he got a ruler out and he thought, I know where that aircraft probably went, and I've got a pretty fair idea if it's going to crash where it would crash. Which turned out to be right. So he managed to take off. His little 6-year-old daughter wanted to go with him. she said, "Daddy, can I come and see the crash site?" And he said, no. He took his horse part of the way. And I think from basically the knowledge that I've got, and I've got a map, he followed the track from present day up to the border track. And then he saw from halfway along there this tree that was clearly burnt. Now, he was such a superb bushman. I've got his full account, which is about 80 pages. A very good writer. He's very descriptive. He was a bushman that we probably don't even know of these days, who could read the terrain. He took very little with him. He didn't even have a spare set of clothing. He just took off, and I'll show you what he took with him. Anyway, he did find them. And let's talk about Bernard for a moment. He was married with one daughter, Irish parents. We went to Gregory Terrace. He worked on a farm, and they basically, this is where I do need the pointer, I think. Thank you. He got to the ridge, and about 4.5 miles away. Oh, that's got to go in there, has it? Okay, thank you. Oh, okay, we've lost the, okay. Oh, thank you. Oh, there we go. There's O'Reilly's present day receipt. Now he got to about here, and he looked across, and he woke up in the morning. He slept against the tree. And he woke up in the morning, he was just standing, and the clouds just parted. Now, in his book, he describes it as almost a spiritual Christian type experience, that God opened the clouds. He could see the tree 4.5 miles away. And the most remarkable thing was, he then took a straight line towards it. He didn't follow necessarily, the track that we know. He went through 3 ravines, which is a remarkable thing to do when you think about it. Only a bushman of his experience could do that and still keep his track. Now, the 2 survivors, which were Proud and Binstead, they had decided they'd call out cooey every hour, and they were still doing it 8, 9 days later. And he could hear them, but he thought it was another rescue party. So he didn't reply. And he got to their site, and he was traumatized by what he saw, because they were in a pretty bad way. In fact, Binstead had said to Proud, he'd been going down to the nearby creek, which was about 300 feet down, and taking a thermos of water back. And apparently he said to Proud, "I can't do it anymore. This is the last time I can go down and get water for you." So they were almost at the point of giving up. Now, when Bernard O'Reilly took off, and this is actually out of a children's book, but it's very accurate, that's basically what he took with him. He took onions, a loaf of bread, a billy can, which was a jam tin, some tea, snakebite kit, no spare clothing, and that was pretty well all that he took with him to go and find. Now, some people said, why didn't he take some more significant supplies? I don't think he expected anyone to be alive. I think he felt after that amount of time that there wouldn't be any survivors. He saw it's 6 miles away, or almost 5, and that was hard up against a tree. Apparently, he walked in, and here were these 2 fellows on death's door. And apparently, the first question that one of them put to, they were surprised to see him. It's like an apparition. And the first question, I think it was Proud who put it to him, was, you know what the first question was? What's the cricket score? You knew the answer, did you? And he said, well, when I left, Bradman was still batting, and I think he got about 156 or something like that. So that was the last I heard was. The second one is, will you stop labouring and make us a cup of tea? So he did that. He realised they didn't have long to live, so he took off very quickly, and he charged down the mountain, the stream. What had happened to Westray, and if there's any botanists in the room, they would be able to tell me, but there's a vine that is very similar to a vine in the UK, which is actually quite strong. And Westray had grabbed hold of a vine, and he'd lost his balance, and he'd fallen about 15 metres and broken his ankle. And he did what you would do if you have an injury. He put his ankle in some cold water, but he couldn't continue. And Bernard found evidence of his fall and found him with his back against a rock with a half-smoked cigarette in his hand. He thought he might have still been alive, but he was clearly dead. Sadly, the crows had got him a bit, and he then carried on. Now, that was later in the day, so that was on dusk, and he charged down, and what he did was really remarkable. He didn't suffer any injury. He must have been extraordinarily fit, and he ran out into Christmas Creek, where he found a young fellow out who was shooting bats, and apparently he's frightened the life out of this young chap. I think his name was Buchanan, and he said, I found the survivors, you know, we've got to get help. So then the rescue party got organised. Bernard O'Reilly went back that next day with a doctor and a policeman and a couple of other people, and they went up the Christmas Creek area. You people who've been to the crash site, have you been up that one, or did you go? That apparently is pretty tough. It sure is. I got as far as about halfway up, and we decided we needed a rope. You couldn't. I don't think. Well, anyway, we decided we didn't have the time to do it. We went out with National Parks out to.
There is a cliff there with a fig tree growing out.
You can do it. I mean, we gave up, I think. Anyway, he went up, and the doctor had a saw with him. Why did the doctor have a saw with him? Bernard said, "Oh, Proud has a fracture," and that's. Let me just talk. Why didn't the doctor need to saw off the leg? What had saved Proud's leg? Maggots, yeah, they'd eaten the gangrene, and apparently my daughter's a nurse. She said they still use magnets even in modern day medicine, particularly for things like breast cancer. And maggots were used extensively during the Second World War and war injuries if you got nothing better. They had saved his leg. He was a cripple for the rest of his life, but his leg was saved simply because the maggots had eaten the dead flesh. The stretcher track was. Oh, lost my. Anyway, the stretcher track came in from the Bay Desert side, and they got an old hermit. So they went in from the other end, from the western side. They found them and they stabilised them. They camped overnight and they took them out the next day. And apparently there was a whole community of men involved, about 100 or so, who took turns at bringing the stretchers down. That's the challenging rescue. Proud and Binstead were left in a tent overnight. Bernard finally had a rest when he got back down after they'd taken the stretcher party. And they claim that he actually had about 4 hours sleep in 48 hours. And he'd been up, down. Amazing story. There was national media, and the 4 grave sites, they decided to, well, I don't think there was very much of them because there was a significant burn. So to talk about grave sites, there wouldn't have been much left, and the police sergeant who was there decided that they should be buried on site. They took, when Bernard was coming down, he was rather disturbed about where Westray was because he thought his body could be washed down the creek. So he moved him, and his family wanted the body taken out, and 2 of the Buchanan boys carried a lead coffin in to take him out. I only found this out when I was up at O'Reilly's about 18 months ago. There was a woman there whose grandfather was involved in the rescue. And apparently when his family got to where Bernard they had buried him temporarily, they said, "Oh, we really like where he is. He's in this, sort of really peaceful setting. We want to leave him here." And that's where the site, and that's a photograph of the actual burial place. Some of you have probably been to that. Yeah, it's quite serene, isn't it? It's very peaceful. And so they said to these 2 fellows who carried the lead coffin in, "No, take it back again. We're not carrying a body back." Might have been relieved. That's the crash site. And someone, sadly, unfortunately, people keep vandalising the little plaques that are there. What came about after that? Well, they improved the weather sightings, and they put a telephone service into Leamington. That radios were installed in all commercial aircraft. That was in the throes. That Stinson didn't have one. The decision to fly or not to fly was taken away from the airlines. So the Department of Defence, and then later on the Civil Aviation, made the decision and told people they had to file a flight plan and that they couldn't fly if the weather was bad, which probably would have happened. What happened to the 4 Stinsons? Interestingly, one crashed about 6 weeks later on takeoff at Archerfield, and it crashed for a very simple reason. It had no fuel. So it got to the end of the runway. So not a good idea to take off with an empty fuel tank. There was only 2 deaths in that. And then a couple of them were converted to 2-engine aircraft. They changed the engines. But because of that wing structure, one of them flew off from Essendon at the end of, or very close to the end of the Second World War, and the wing fell off and they lost 10 or 8 passengers, I think it was, just near Essendon. And so the other one were grounded. So they were actually not a particularly safe aircraft. And one of the criticisms was the way the struts were coming from the top down to the wing rather than the other way. Proud and Binstead never flew again, either under his real name or any other name. I think he'd had enough. They didn't really like each other. They were two different. I mean, Proud was from a wealthy, background. Binstead was, but I think he did a good job. He was very brave the way he apparently Proud said to him a couple of times, mate, you better go because I'm not going to survive. He said, no, I'm not leaving without you. I'll stick around. So it's very good. They both did pretty well. They didn't meet very often, but they did get together. If you go to the gardens next to the guest house, there's a rock there. And that's where that photograph is taken, where you have Proud, Binstead and O'Reilly sort of talking together.